Happy Friday! It's Friday. We are gonna read on Friday. Hope you guys had a great week. Welcome to Quarantine Story Time, reading War and Peace while we stay inside or limit our social interaction or perhaps have furlough from work due to COVID-19. So, just trying to find a silver lining in the cloud of COVID-19. And that is finally reading one of the longest pieces of classic literature known to the Western world. At this point, we're more than halfway through, but just a little bit more than halfway through. So, which is both encouraging and discouraging at the same time. Feeling like I need to be making more progress, but I'll try to read longer sections next week. What else? If you missed a section or if this is your first time tuning in, I have a War and Peace playlist that has all the readings so far, and they're all in order. Obviously, the date I've read them are in order, but they also all have the number of the volume, part, and section, so you can follow along in the book if you want to. Today we're doing volume 3, part 2, sections 9 through 12. So yeah, I think there are a bunch of short sections coming up, and we're going to try to plow through some more stuff here. And as you recall, this is it's now 1812. Napoleon has invaded Russia, and Andrei Bolkonsky is with the army, as is young Nikolai Rostov, and Andrei Bolkonsky's father just passed away. So I think we're picking up with when we last left. It was his sister, Princess Maria, and her reaction to the death, and then the small little funeral. But the French are getting really close to them, so they really need to skedaddle on out of there. But now they're tied up with, death and burial and all that stuff. So let's see what happens. Section 9. Bogue Chavarro, before Prince Andrei settled there, had always been an absentee estate. And the Bogue Chavarro peasants had quite a different character from those of Bald Hills. They differed from them in speech, dress, and disposition. They were called the steppe folk. The old prince had praised them for their endurance at work when they came to help out with the harvest at Bald Hills or to dig ponds and ditches, but had disliked them for their wildness. Prince Andrei's last day in Bogue Chavarro, with his innovations, clinics, schools, and the reducing of the quintret, had not softened their disposition, but on the contrary had increased in them the traits of the character which the old prince called wildness. Among them there was always some vague talk going around, now about enlisting them all as Cossacks, now about a new faith to which they were to be converted, now about some charter from the Tsars, now about an oath to Pavel Petrovich in 1797, of which it was said that they had already been granted their freedom then, but that the landowners had taken it away. Now about Pyotr Fyodorovich, who was to begin to reign in 7 years, and under whom everything would be free and so simple that there would be nothing at all. The rumors of war and Bonaparte and his invasion combined for them with equally vague notions of the Antichrist, the end of the world, and pure freedom. The neighborhood of Bogue Chavarro were all large villages belonging to the crown or to absentee landowners. Very few landowners actually lived there. There were also very few domestic and literate serfs, and in the lives of the peasants in this area there appeared, more noticeably and strongly than in others, those mysterious currents of popular Russian life that the causes and meaning of which are inexplicable for contemporaries. One of these phenomena, which had manifested itself among the peasants of that locality 20 years before, was a movement to migrate to some warm rivers. Hundreds of peasants, Bogue Chavarro peasants among them, suddenly began selling their cattle and leaving with their families for somewhere in the southeast. As birds fly somewhere beyond the seas, these people, with their wives and children, made for somewhere there in the southeast where none of them had ever been. They made up caravans, bought themselves one bought themselves out one by one, ran away, and drove and walked there to the warm rivers. Many were perished, exiled to Siberia, or many were punished, exiled to Siberia, many died on the road of cold and hunger. Many came back of themselves, and the movement died down, just as it had begun without any obvious reason. But the undercurrents never ceased to flow among these people, and there were gatherings of some sort of new forces in order to manifest themselves just as strangely and unexpectedly, and at the same time as simply, naturally, and strongly. Now, in the year 1812, it was noticeable for a man living close to the people that those undercurrents were intensely at work and were close to manifesting themselves. Alpatych, having come to Bogue Chavarro a short time before the old prince's passing, noticed that there was an agitation among the people, and that contrary to what was happening in the region of Bald Hills, where over a 40-mile radius all peasants were going away, leaving their villages to be devastated by the Cossacks, in the steppe region of Bogue Chavarro, the peasants, it was heard, had communicated with the French, received some sort of leaflet that circulated among them, and were staying put. He knew through the domestic servants who were devoted to him that the muzhik Karp, who had great influence on the community, had made a trip in a government-owned cart the other day and had come back with news that the Cossacks devastated villages abandoned by their inhabitants, but that the French did not touch them. He knew that another muzhik, the evening before, had even brought from the village of Vyslukhovo, where the French were camped, a leaflet from a French general which announced to the inhabitants that no harm would be done to them, and that whatever was taken from them would be paid for if they stayed. As proof of it, the muzhik brought from Vyslukhovo 100 rubles in banknotes, not knowing they were counterfeit, which he had been paid in advance for hay. Finally, most important of all, Alpatych learned that on the same day that he ordered the headman to prepare carts for transporting the princess's baggage from Bogue Chavarro, there had been a meeting in the village in the morning at which it had been decided to wait and not go anywhere. And meanwhile, time was running out. The marshal insisted on the 15th of August, the day of the prince's death, that Princess Maria should leave that same day, as it was becoming dangerous. He said that after the 16th, he could not answer for anything. On the day of the prince's death, he left in the evening, but promised to come for the funeral the next day. But the next day he could not come, because according to the news he had received, the French had advanced unexpectedly, and he barely managed to remove his family and all his valuables from his estate. For 30 years, Bogue Chavarro had been managed by the headman Dron, whom the old prince had called Dronushka. Dron was one of those physically and morally sturdy muzhiks who, once they come of age and grow a beard, live on that way, unchanging until they are 60 or 70 without a single gray hair or missing tooth, as straight and as strong as at the age of 60 as at 30. Dron, soon after the migration to the warm rivers, in which he had taken part like the others, had been made headman and mayor of Bogue Chavarro, and since then had remained in those duties irreproachably for 23 years. The muzhiks feared him more than the master. The gentlemen, both the old prince and the young, and the steward respected him and jokingly called him minister. In all the time of his service, Dron had never once been drunk or sick, never, either after sleepless nights or after any sort of labor, had he shown the slightest fatigue. And though illiterate, never had he forgotten a single accounting of money and sacks of flour for the enormous shipments he sold, nor a single stack of grain on any acre of the Bogue Chavarro fields. It was this Dron whom Alpatych, having come from the devastated Bald Hills, summoned to him on the day of the prince's funeral and ordered to prepare 12 horses for the princess's carriages and 18 carts for a train that was to be made up at Bogue Chavarro. Though the peasants there were on quitrent, the fulfillment of this order could not present any difficulties, in Alpatych's opinion, because there were 230 households at Bogue Chavarro and the peasants were well-to-do. But the headman Dron, having heard the order, silently lowered his eyes. Alpatych named for him some muzhiks whom he knew and from whom he ordered the carts to be taken. Dron replied that those muzhiks had their horses hired out. Alpatych named some other muzhiks, and they too had no horses, according to Dron. Some were pulling government carts, others were too weak, still others had dropped dead from lack of fodder. In Dron's opinion, it was impossible to collect any horses, not only for the carting, but even for the carriages. Alpatych looked at Dron attentively and frowned. Just as Dron was an exemplary headman muzhik, so it was not for Alpatych, that had managed the prince's estate for 20 years and was So it was not for nothing that Alpatich had managed the prince's estate for 20 years and was an exemplary steward. He was capable in the highest degree of understanding intuitively the needs and instincts of the people he was dealing with, and that was why he was an excellent steward. Having glanced at Drawn, he understood at once that Drawn's replies were not the expression of Drawn's thoughts, but the expression of the general mood of the Bogue Chavarro community in which the headman was already caught up. But along with that, he knew that Drawn, grown rich and therefore hated by the community, was bound to waver between the two camps, the masters and the peasants. He noticed this wavering in his eyes, and therefore Alpatich frowned and moved closer to Drawn. "Listen, Dronyushka," he said. "No empty talk with me. His Excellency, Prince Andrei Nikolaich himself has ordered me to have all the people sent away and not left to the enemy. And there's a Tsar's orders for it. And whoever stays is a traitor to the Tsar. Do you hear?" "I hear," Drawn replied without raising his eyes. Alpatich was not satisfied with this response. Drawn, it'll go badly for you," Alpatich said, shaking his head. "The power's yours," Drawn said ruefully. "Drop it, Drawn," said Alpatich, taking his hand from behind his lapel and pointing with a solemn gesture at the floor under Drawn's feet. "I not only see through you, I see through everything 7 feet under you," he said, staring at the floor under Drawn's feet. Interesting expression. Drawn became troubled, glanced fleetingly at Alpatich, and again lowered his eyes. "Drop this nonsense and tell the people to get ready to leave home for Moscow and to prepare carts tomorrow morning for the princess's baggage, and don't go to any meetings. Do you hear?" Drawn suddenly fell at his feet. "Yakov Alpatich, release me! Take the keys from me! Release me, for Christ's sake!" "Drop it," Alpatich said sternly. "I see through 7 feet under you," he repeated, knowing that his skill in beekeeping, his knowledge of when to sow oats, and the fact that for 20 years he had been able to please the old prince had long since earned him the reputation of a sorcerer, and that the ability to see 7 feet under a man was ascribed to sorcerers. That's really interesting. Drawn stood up and was about to say something, but Alpatich interrupted him. "What's this you've got in your heads, eh? What are you thinking, eh?" "What can I do with the people?" said Drawn. "They're all riled up." "I did tell them." "So you told them," said Alpatich. "Drinking?" he asked curtly. "All riled up, Yakov Alpatich. Brought a second barrel." "Listen then, I'll go for the police chief and you tell that to the people, and that they should drop all this and furnish the carts." "Yes, sir," replied Drawn. Yakov Alpatich did not insist further. He had been managing peasants for a long time and knew that the main means of getting people to obey consisted in not showing them any suspicion that they might not obey. Having obtained the obedient "yes, sir" from Drawn, Yakov Alpatich was satisfied with that, though he not only suspected that, but was almost certain that the carts would not be furnished without the help of the militia. And indeed, no carts had been rounded up by evening. In the village, there was a meeting by the pothouse, and at the meeting it was decided to drive the horses into the forest and not supply any carts. Saying nothing about it to the princess, Alpatich ordered his own baggage that he had brought from Bald Hills unloaded, and that those horses prepared to be harnessed to the princess's carriages, and he himself drove to the authorities. Section 10. After her father's funeral, Princess Marya locked herself up in her room and refused to see anyone. A maid came to the door to tell her that Alpatich had come to ask for orders about the departure. This was before Alpatich's conversation with Drawn. Princess Marya got up from the couch she was lying on and through the closed door said that she would never go anywhere and asked to be left in peace. The windows of the room in which Princess Marya was lying gave on the west. She lay on the couch facing the wall, fingering the buttons on the leather cushion, saw nothing but the cushion, and her vague thoughts were concentrated on one thing. She was thinking of the irrevocability of death, and of her own inner loathsomeness, which she had not known about until then, and which had shown itself during her father's illness. She wanted, but did not dare to pray, did not dare to address herself to God in the state of soul she was in. She lay in that position for a long time. The sun went down on the other side of the house, and its slanting evening rays shone through the open window into the room and on to the part of the morocco cushion Princess Marya was lying on. The flow of her thoughts suddenly stopped. She unconsciously sat up, smoothed her hair, rose, and went to the windows, involuntarily breathing in the coolness of the clear but breezy evening. "Yes, it's easy for you to admire the evening now. He's gone and nobody will hinder you," she said to herself, and sinking onto a chair let her head drop to the windowsill. Someone called her name in a tender and soft voice from the garden side and kissed her on the head. She glanced up. It was Mademoiselle Bourrienne in a black dress and weepers. She quietly approached Princess Marya, kissed her with a sigh, and at once began to cry. Princess Marya glanced around at her. She remembered all her former clashes with her, her jealousy of her. She remembered, too, that how he had recently changed towards Mademoiselle Bourrienne, could not bear the sight of her, and therefore how unfair were the reproaches she had made to her in her heart. And is it for me, who wishes for his death, to judge anyone, she thought? Princess Marya vividly pictured the position of Mademoiselle Bourrienne, who had been distanced from her company recently, and who at the same time depended on her and lived in a house not her own. And she felt sorry for her. She gave her a meekly questioning look and held out her hand to her. Mademoiselle Bourrienne at once began to cry, kiss her hand, and speak of the grief that had befallen the princess, making herself a sharer in that grief. She said that her sole consolation in that grief was that the princess allowed her to share it with her. She said that all the old misunderstandings should be turned to naught before this great grief, that she felt herself pure before everyone, and that he could see her love and gratitude from there. The princess listened to her without understanding her words, but glancing at her from time to time and listening to the sounds of her voice. Your position is doubly terrible, dear princess, said Mademoiselle Bourrienne after a brief pause. I realize that you could not and cannot think for yourself, but my love for you obliges me to do so. Did Alpatych come to see you? Did he talk to you about leaving? She asked. Princess Marya did not reply. She did not understand who had to leave and for where. Is it possible to understand anything, to think about anything now? Does anything make any difference? She did not reply. Do you know, chérie Marie, said Mademoiselle Bourrienne, do you know that we are in danger, that we are surrounded by the French? To leave now is dangerous. If we go, we're almost certain to be taken prisoners, and God knows. Princess Marya glanced at her friend without understanding what she was talking about. Ah, if anyone knew how little difference it makes to me now, she said. Naturally, I would not wish to leave him for anything. Alpatych said something to me about leaving. Talk with him. There's nothing I can or want to do. I did talk with him. He hopes we will manage to leave tomorrow, but I think it will be better now to stay here, said Mademoiselle Bourrienne, because you'll agree, chérie Marie, to fall into the hands of soldiers or rebellious muzhiks on the road would be terrible. Mademoiselle Bourrienne took from her reticule and handed to the princess an announcement by the French general Rameau on unusual non-Russian paper that the inhabitants should not abandon their homes, that they should be duly protected by the French. I think it's better to turn to this general, said Mademoiselle Bourrienne, and I'm sure you'll be treated with due respect. Princess Marya read the leaflet, and her face twitched with dry sobs. Whom did you get this from? She asked. They probably found out that I have a French name, Mademoiselle Bourrienne said, blushing. Princess Marya, the leaflet in her hand, got up from the window and with a pale face went to Prince Andrei's former study. Dunyasha, send me Alpatych. Dronyushka, somebody, said Princess Marya, and tell Amalia Karlovna not to come in here, she added, hearing the voice of Mademoiselle Bourrienne. To leave quickly. Quickly leave, Princess Marya repeated, horrified at the thought that she might remain in the power of the French. That Prince Andrei should learn that she was in the power of the French, that she, the daughter of Nikolai Andreevich Bolkonsky, should beg Mr. General Rameau to protect her and be her benefactor. This thought horrified her, made her shudder, blush, and experience fits of anger and pride such as she had never felt before. All that was painful and above all insulting in her position vividly presented itself to her. They, the French, will settle in this house. Mr. General Rameau will occupy Prince Andrei's study, will amuse himself going through and reading his letters and papers. Mademoiselle Bourrienne lui fera les honneurs de Bogue Chavarro. I'll be given a small room as a favor. The soldiers will devastate my father's fresh grave to take his crosses and decorations. They'll tell me about their victories over the Russians. They'll feign sympathy with my grief, thought Princess Marya, not according to her own mind, but feeling it her duty to think for herself the thoughts of her father and brother. For herself, personally, it made no difference whether she stayed or what happened to her, but she felt herself at the same time the representative of her late father and of Prince Andrei. She involuntarily thought their thoughts and gave and felt their feelings. Whatever they would have done now, she felt it necessary to do the same. She went into Prince Andrei's study, and taking and trying to be penetrated by his thoughts, reflected on her position. The demands of life, which she had considered annihilated by her father's death, suddenly emerged before Princess Marya as a new, as yet unknown force, and gripped her. Agitated, flushed, she paced the room, demanded to see Alpatych, then Mikhail Ivanovich, then Tikhon, then Dron. Dunyasha, the nanny, and all the maids could tell her nothing about the extent to which what Mademoiselle Bourrienne had told her was correct. Alpatych was not at home. He had gone to the authorities. The architect Mikhail Ivanovich, when summoned, appeared before Princess Marya with sleepy eyes and could tell her nothing. With the same smile of agreement with which it had been his habit over 15 years to respond without expressing his own opinion to the old prince's remarks, he now responded to Princess Marya, so that nothing definite could be drawn from his responses. The old valet Tikhon, when summoned, came with a sagging and sunken face which bore the stamp of incurable grief, answered, "Yes, ma'am," to all Princess Marya's questions, and could barely hold back his sobs looking at her. Finally, the headman, Dron, came to the room and, bowing low to the princess, stopped on the threshold. Princess Marya walked across the room, stopped, facing him. "Drunyashka," said Princess Marya, seeing in him an unquestionable friend, the same Drunyashka who, from his annual trip to the fair in Vyazma, brought back each time a gingerbread he bought specially and handed it to her with a smile. "Drunyashka, now, after our misfortune," she began, and fell silent, unable to speak. "We all walk under God," he said with a sigh. They were both silent. "Drunyashka, Alpatych has gone off somewhere. I have no one to turn to. Is it true that what they say to me, that it's impossible for me to leave?" "Why shouldn't you leave, Your Excellency? It's possible to leave," said Dron. "They tell me there's danger from the enemy. Dear heart, I can do nothing. I understand nothing. I have nobody with me. I want to leave for certain during the night or early tomorrow morning." Dron was silent. He glanced at Princess Marya from under his eyebrows. "There's no horses," he said. "I told Yakov Alpatych so." "Why aren't there?" asked the princess. "It's all from God's punishment," said Dron. "Whatever horses there were got taken for the army, and some dropped dead. It's been such a year. Not just for feeding horses, but to keep from starving death ourselves. As it is, they sometimes go 3 days without food. There's nothing. They're completely devastated." Princess Marya listened attentively to what he said to her. "The Muziks are devastated? They have no bread?" she asked. "Starving to death," said Dron. "It's not just carts. But why didn't you tell me, Dronyushka? Can anything be done? I'll do all I can." It was strange for Princess Marya to think that now, at the moment when such grief filled her soul, there could be rich and poor people, and that the rich could not help the poor. She had vaguely known and heard that there was the master's grain, and that it could be given to the Muziks. She also knew that neither her brother nor father would have refused Muziks in need. She was only afraid of somehow making a mistake in words concerning this distributing of grain to the Muziks, which she wanted to order. She was glad that the pretext presented itself to her of a concern which made it not shameful for her to forget her own grief. She started asking Dronyushka for details about the needs of the Muziks and about what belonged to the masters of Bogue Chavarro. "But we do have the master's grain, my brothers," she asked. "The master's grain is all there," Dron said proudly. "Our prince told us not to sell it." "Give it to the Muziks, give them as much as they need. I allow it in my brother's name," said Princess Marya. Dron said nothing and sighed deeply. "Distribute that grain among them, if it will be enough for them. Distribute all of it. I order it in my brother's name, and tell them, what's ours is also theirs. We don't grudge them anything. Tell them that." Dron looked intently at the princess as she spoke. "Release me, mistress. For God's sake, have the keys taken from me," he said. "I've served for 23 years, never did any wrong. Release me, for God's sake." Princess Marya did not understand what he wanted from her and what he was asking to be released from. She replied that she had never doubted his devotion and that she was ready to do anything for him and for the Muziks. Oh dear. Section 11. An hour later, Dunyasha came to the princess with news that Dron had come and that all the Muziks, on the princess's order, had assembled by the barn, wishing to talk with their mistress. "But I never called them," said Princess Marya. "I only told Dron to distribute grain to them." "Only for God's sake, dear princess, order them chased away and don't go out to them. It's all a trick," said Dunyasha. "But Yakov Alpatych will come back and we'll leave, and please don't—" "What sort of trick?" the princess said in surprise. "Only listen to me, for God's sake. I do know. You can ask the nanny. They said they don't agree to leave on your orders." There's something wrong in what you're saying. I never ordered them to leave, said Princess Marya. Call Dranyushka. Dran came and confirmed Dunyasha's words. The muzhiks had come on the princess's orders. But I never called them, said the princess. You must have made a mistake in what you told them. I only said that you should give them grain. Dran sighed and did not reply. If you order it, they'll go away, he said. No, I'll go to them, said Princess Marya. Despite the protests of Dunyasha and the nanny, Princess Marya went out to the porch. Dran, Dunyasha, the nanny, and Mikhail Ivanich followed her. They probably think I'm offering them grain so they'll stay here and that I'll leave myself, abandoning them to the mercy of the French, thought Princess Marya. I'll promise them monthly rations and quarters on the estate near Moscow. I'm sure Andrei would do still more in my place, she thought, approaching in the twilight the crowd standing on the green by the barn. The crowd, clustering together, stirred, and hats were quickly taken off. Princess Marya, her eyes lowered, her legs getting tangled in her dress, went up close to them. So many different old and young eyes were directed at her, and there were so many different faces that Princess Marya could not see any one face, and feeling it necessary to talk to all of them at once, she did not know what to do. But again the awareness of being the representative of her father and brother gave her strength, and she boldly began to speak. I'm very glad that you came, Princess Marya began without raising her eyes and feeling how fast and hard her heart was beating. Tronyushka told me that you have been devastated by the war. That is our common grief, and I will spare nothing to help you. I am leaving myself because it's dangerous here now and the enemy is close, because I'm giving you everything, my friends, and I beg you to take everything, all our grain, so that you won't be in need. And if you were told that I am giving you grain so that you'll stay here, that's not true. On the contrary, I beg you to leave with all your possessions for our estate near Moscow, and that I will take it upon myself and promise you that you will not be in need. You will be given houses and grain. The princess stopped. Nothing but sighs came from the crowd. I'm not doing it of myself, the princess went on. I'm doing it in the name of my late father, who was a good master to you, and of my brother and his son. She stopped again. No one broke her silence. Ours is a common grief, and we shall share everything. All that is mine is yours, she said, looking at the faces that stood before her. All eyes were looking at her with the same expression, the meaning of which she could not understand, whether it was curiosity, devotion, gratitude, or fear, and mistrust. The expression on all the faces was the same. Much obliged for your goodness, only it's not for us to go taking the master's grain, said a voice at the back. But why not? Said the princess. No one answered, and Princess Marya, looking over the crowd, noticed that now all the eyes she met were lowered at once. Why don't you want to? She asked again. No one answered. Princess Marya began to be oppressed by the silence. She tried to catch someone's eyes. Why don't you speak? The princess addressed an old man who stood in front of her, leaning on a stick. Tell me if you think something else is needed. I'll do everything, she said, catching his eyes. But he, as if angered by that, lowered his head altogether and said, What's there to agree to? We don't need your grain. What? Us abandon everything? We don't agree. We're sorry for you, but we're not in agreement. You go by yourself, came from different sides of the crowd. And again, one and the same expression appeared on all the faces in the crowd. Now it was certain not an expression of curiosity and gratitude, but of angrily resolve. But surely you haven't understood, Princess Marya said with a sad smile. Why don't you want to leave? I promised to house you, to feed you, and here the enemy will devastate you. But her voice was drowned out by the voices of the crowd. We're not in agreement. Let them devastate us. We don't take your grain. We're not in agreement. Princess Marya again tried to catch someone's eyes in the crowd, but not a single gaze was directed at her. They obviously avoided her eyes. She felt strange and awkward. See what clever teaching? Follow her into bondage, wreck your houses, and go into servitude. What else? I'll give you my grain, she said, voices said in the crowd. Princess Marya, lowering her head, left the circle and went to the house. After repeating the order to Dran to have the horses ready for departure, she went to her room and remained alone with her thoughts. That night, Princess Marya sat for a long time by the open window in her room, listening to the sounds of the muzhiks' talk, which reached her from the village, but she was not thinking of them. She felt that, however much she thought about them, she could not understand them. She kept thinking about one thing, her grief, which, after the interruption caused by the cares of the present, had already come back to her. Now she could remember, she could weep, she could pray. As the sun set, the wind died down. The night was still and fresh. Towards midnight, the voices began to subside. A cock crowed, the full moon began to appear behind the lindens. A fresh, white, dewy mist rose, and silence now reigned over the village and the house. One after another, she imagined the pictures of the recent past, her father's illness and his last moments, and with sad joy she now dwelt on those images, driving away from her with horror only the one last picture of his death, which she felt unable to contemplate even in her imagination at this still and mysterious hour of the night. And these pictures appeared before her with such clarity and detail that they seemed to her now a reality, now the past, now the future. Then she vividly pictured the moment when he had had the stroke and had been dragged under the arms from the garden in Bald Hills and had muttered something with his strengthless tongue, twitched his gray eyebrows, and looked at her anxiously and timidly. He wanted to tell me even then what he told me on the day of his death, she thought. He had always thought what he told me. And here Princess Marya remembered in all its details that night at Bald Hills on the eve of his stroke, when, having a foreboding of disaster, she had stayed with him against his will. She had not slept, and at night had tiptoed downstairs and, going to the door of the flower room, where her father was spending that night, had listened to his voice. In a suffering, weary voice, he was saying something to Tikhon. He evidently wanted to talk. Why didn't he call me? Why didn't he allow me to be there instead of Tikhon? Princess Marya wondered then and now. Now he'll never tell anyone all that was in his soul. Neither for him nor for me will this moment ever come back when he could say everything he wanted to say, and I, not Tikhon, could listen and understand him. Why didn't I go into the room then, she wondered. Maybe he would have told me then what he said on the day of his death. He did ask twice about me then, during his talk with Tikhon. He wanted to see me, and I stood there outside the door. It was sad. It was hard for him to talk with Tikhon, who didn't understand him. I remember he mentioned Liza to him, as though she were alive. He had forgotten she had died, and Tikhon reminded him that she was no more, and he cried, "Fool!" It was hard for him. I heard from outside the door how he lay down, groaning on his bed, and cried loudly, "My God! Why didn't I go in then? What would he have done to me? What would I have lost?" And perhaps then he would have been comforted and would have told me his word. And Princess Marya said aloud the endearing words he had said to her on the day of his death. Dear heart. Princess Marya repeated the words and sobbed with tears that eased her soul. She now saw his face before her. Not the face she had known ever since she could remember, and which she had always seen from a distance, but the face, timid and weak, which on the last day, as she bent close to his mouth to hear what he said, she had seen for the first time close up with all its wrinkles and details. Dear heart, she repeated. What was he thinking when he said those words? What is he thinking now? The question suddenly came to her, and in response to it, she saw him before her with the expression he had in the coffin, on his face bound with a white handkerchief, and the horror that had seized her then, when she had touched him and become convinced not only that it was not he, but that it was something mysterious and repugnant, seized her now. She wanted to think about other things, wanted to pray, and could do nothing. She stared wide-eyed at the moonlight and shadows, expecting every second to see his dead face, and felt that the silence that hung over the house and within her held her fast. Dunyasha, she whispered. Dunyasha! She cried in a wild voice, and tearing free of the silence, she ran to the maid's room, towards the nanny and the maids who came running to her. And we will end there for today and for this week. That is the end of section 12. And Monday, we will have another lovely section, I am sure. Sorry, some of it's a little stumbly today. I'm always reading it for the first time with you guys, so sometimes it gets a little, I get a little tripped up with some of the Tolstoy's like cadence of words. Which he is not lacking in words. But yeah, it's very interesting. Some of his observations and some of his like expressions are really funny and interesting. Also, I think it's really like the funny little thing of like what they constitute being a sorcerer. He's like, well, I'm a good beekeeper, so people think I'm a sorcerer. And it's like pretty funny. But yeah, I guess we always have weird beliefs throughout time, weird things that we attribute to certain things. So it's always interesting to hear a different perspective. Well, but anyways, that's the reading for today. I must dash. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you Monday. Bye.